Control players unite.
Hey Control Nation, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Dr. Red. This video is a presentation on Learning the Art of Control Part 2. First, we will review the contents of the previous video on Learning the Art of Control Part 1. Second, we will discuss the overall deck building goal of your control decks. Third, we will note the two kinds of cards in your opponent's decks you need to focus on. Fourth, we will explain how to go about making choices throughout the matches. Fifth, we will elaborate on the concept of inevitability. Sixth, we will cover 3 common mistakes the control style player makes. And finally, we will conclude with what to remember about control style. To begin the review, control revolves around the reactive attitude. To play control is to play defense. You are not aggressing your opponent. With that in mind, control responds to aggressive play with, how can I neutralize the threat, not how can I KO something. To better neutralize, one must anticipate one's opponent's lists. For example, if you want to play an energy control deck, it's best to know how many energies each archetype is typically running so you know how to play your deck in those specific matchups. How to play your deck revolves around alternative win conditions. You win by forcing your opponent to concede through some other means than taking prize cards. And the concession process is sped up by gathering resources to give oneself greater card advantage than one's opponent. And with the review complete, let's address the first topic in deck building goals. As a control style player, your deck building goal is to play towards the late game. In particular, your unique win condition according to the method of control you choose. The early game is when you set up your board to enact your strategy. The mid game is when you actually enact your strategy and maneuver around your opponent's plays. And while there are various definitions of late game, it essentially comes down to strategies being established and nothing new appearing on the board. Your opponents have done what they need to do, and you are not expecting anything strange or unusual to come out of nowhere. With that being said, playing towards the late game means you want to outlast your opponents, i.e. survive, such that they run themselves out of resources, with your helping them in the process, of course. In order to begin running them out of resources, however, one needs to focus on combating 2 kinds of cards. The first are cards that help your opponent reach the late game. These are called long-term card advantage cards because they can continually recycle resources. For example, Baxcalibur attaching energies in Chien-Pao EX decks. You also want to go after cards that provide resources. For example, suppose you have the opportunity to ability lock one of your opponent's 2 ability Pokemon. You would choose the one that provides better or more resources depending on the situation. For example, Bibarel with its ability to continually draw cards each turn. And for the early and mid games, you want to go after any cards that make your strategy nigh impossible to enact once they are ready for action. For example, Archeops charging up everything on a Lugia V-Star board. Thus, when you're preparing for these kinds of threats, ladies and gentlemen, it's important to know what to do and when. With that being said, we move on to the next topic in making choices. When playing control style, one must learn when to say yes, meaning don't be trigger happy. Just because you can make a move doesn't mean you should. What you need to do instead is prioritize survival. Develop your board, generate card advantage, and do whatever it takes to disarm your opponent's advances. And your opponent advances with threats. And it's helpful to think of combating them in 2 forms. Exponential advantage is simultaneously neutralizing multiple threats. Think, for example, of multiple ability locks with Gastrodon. And then there's linear advantage, which is neutralizing a single threat. For example, Enamorous V against Dusknoir. So with these ideas of goals and choices in mind, we move into the major control concept that guides our gameplay, and that is inevitability. In battle, a war of attrition is a wearing down of the opponent's personnel, resources, and morale. In the Pokemon TCG, attrition is slowly wasting away your opponent's cards, and in playing control, probably their morale as well. Likewise, victory for one side is inevitable when it is impossible for one's opponents to recover their losses. In other words, inevitability is a foregone conclusion, meaning that the control player is certain to win. It is coupled with the fact that the control player has access to so many resources, it doesn't matter what the opponents do, the loss is already upon them. And so, taking into consideration everything else in this presentation, the overarching question the control player asks is, when will I reach inevitability with this deck? Because when you reach inevitability, you are guaranteed the win. The answer varies according to the control method and the opponent's archetype. For example, in general, block Snorlax reaches Inevitability when it traps a useless Pokemon in the active spot and eliminates all switches. No matter what the opponents do, they cannot win. A loss is inevitable. Each archetype is different, so you need to assess it as you build your decks. But before you reach Inevitability, what can go wrong in the middle of all your assessments during the match? The following are the common mistakes found in control style play. First, countering the wrong card. For example, you go after your opponent's Manaphy instead of Bibarel. Manaphy is useless in this matchup for your opponent and you cannot capitalize, but Bibarel is gaining card advantage for your opponent and yet you choose to ignore it. Second, thinking too linearly. In other words, don't stay only on defense if a quick KO can help you. Always take the win condition. For example, I once had a Pidgeot EX out on turn 2, so I searched for a double turbo energy and took the KO for a victory. It was neither my normal strategy nor win condition, but it worked. Last, playing into your opponent's strategy, i.e. taking the bait. For example, your opponent tries to distract you by discarding 2 boss's orders with an Ultra Ball. You assume they don't have any more, so you carelessly overbench and it ruins your win con. A final word. Remember, control is not about reacting for its own sake. The actions are done with purpose and the win condition in mind. Keep the lessons here handy and you will go far. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. What did I miss? Where am I wrong? Please leave a comment, take care of yourselves, and may God hold you in the palm of his hand.